the Forgotten Age, a time lost in the history of Eorzea, a time some would say was best forgotten. We now are at the point where history starts to catch up with the present, and one of the more unasked questions to us historians is what has happened during the Forgotten Age? Of course, we won't just be talking about the Forgotten Age, as it is also the forefront of what will be the time where three major powers almost sunk Eorzea into darkness due to their what seemed to be unending war. It was called the War of the Magi, and we'll get to that later, as we will briefly touch upon something of a theory on what might have happened during the Forgotten Age. For many of us, the Forgotten Age was not seen as very important. We lore buffs have pondered about it, of course, but if we take what the Eorzean Encyclopedia gave us, well, it's not much, really. There exists almost no record of the years immediately following the fall of the mighty Allegan Empire. The Dark Period is loosely referred to as the Forgotten Age, for very little is known of how the people lived. But theories can be speculated from the Forgotten Age, the first of which was the recovery from the Calamity. Because the blame of everything that had happened was put onto the Allegans, the other tribes and races saw fit to place all types of punishment onto the remaining people. Context clues aside, there are no evidence that full-blooded Allegans live today, and I mean full-blooded. I'm sure there are those that have ancestry in the Allegan Empire, but they are not fully blooded. When it comes to country takeovers, you can imagine what might happen to the citizens who have nothing to do with politics or military, so the many Allegan civilians were possibly enslaved, exiled, or also put to death alongside the royals. The more reasonable theory is that they were enslaved or assimilated into the rest of the races. Remember, survivors were very much possible since many of the important Allegans were able to survive the Calamity on the floating isle that is Azys La, and even more so, there were some that were not in the Crystal Tower when it fell. I would assume the remaining people were but civilians, and the very few scientists and royals who remain were in hiding. Throughout the Forgotten Times, technology must have been eliminated. New standards were created as technology was destroyed, and the Allegans were made as an example of their hubris. One can also assume that most of the Forgotten Age was more or less rebuilding after what had happened, but in the background, society laid in wake for the time when blame of the Calamity would come to pass. The fourth Astral Era was the fall of civilization. Royals and scientific minds of the remaining Allegans were either exiled or put to death. Some even say the remaining exiled started another society far out into the old world. Most of the citizens who were not part of the higher society of Allegan were assumed to have been assimilated in various ways. One could imagine how, but know that it is not something that even I would like to share, deeming the imagery of these times and events might be a bit graphic. This could also mean that some present-day Eorzean may actually have some heritage in the Allegan Empire, as a node even recognized us as a citizen, albeit a low or mixed breed. Religious groups quickly took over and made it law that having such knowledge from the Allegan Empire and all their tech must no longer be in society, so much so that knowledge and learning itself was very much limited. Adults would not teach their children any of the alphabet, which led to illiteracy and simple culture, going back to something of a second era kind of society, where higher learning was shunned and the religious cult made it so they were the ones ruling. In this case, for about 1500 years, the fifth Umbral Era was one of the worst experiences in Eorzea's history. Snow and ice became regular weather for some years, as though winter was coming in Eorzea, like Game of Thrones. When it hit, winter stayed for many years. This promptly killed off many people, if not for the lack of trying, since vegetation was killed off by the cold. Animals all but died or disappeared, and fish, who you would expect to survive the cold, died off slowly, ultimately killing off the food resources of the region. Also known as the Age of Eternal Frost, one blood-brine sea was completely frozen over. This allowed a migrant Mikote tribe to travel south past the Giribanian peaks from southern Isilbard. Even after being persecuted and driven out by the Alligans over 2,000 years ago, the Mikote found themselves back into the realm due to their survivalist instincts. This also gave the Mikote the inspiration to name their 26 tribes after the new Eorzean alphabet that was invented during those times, an alphabet originally for the use of those gifted with privilege, but quickly spread due to those who sought high learning and wished to teach that to others. The 5th Astral Era was a slow recovery from the eternal winter. People wanting a place to pray created the cathedral in the now known area called the Black Shroud in order to worship the 12 and revitalize their own use of magic. The same cathedral seen and used today for the ceremony of eternal bonds, a place where two declare their love for one another under the eyes of the 12. This place was, however, used not just to pray to the gods, but to cultivate magic that had been developing over time while waiting out the winter. As the winter died down, people once again spread, creating tribes, then towns, then cities once again. This, however, led to people splitting up the gods per each society created, making the once shared belief of the 12 to religious groups only worshipping one at a time. For example, the Alamegans worship Rolgar, though acknowledging that there are 11 other gods through other nations. The splitting of the gods and separate teachings of different magic would eventually cause one of Eorzea's bloodiest wars, and an even more surprising ending which made it look like the world had enough of this war crap. As the years go by, city-states at exactly 12 nations popped up all over Eorzea, many of which changed and assimilated into other city-states due to population and resources. Ultimately, 6 were left to exist to the land, with 3 being the most powerful. The Dark City of Mach, the purveyors of black and void magic, the ancient city of Amdapor, the founders of white magic, and the floating city of Nim, home to the tactical scholars. These 3 nations will be what spark one of the bloodiest wars in Eorzea's history, and form the current world state we have today. It is finally time to talk about the biggest war that may have hit Eorzea. I say may because currently we are at war with the Garleans and the Ascian survivors at the same time. Let's start this section out with some information on the big 3. Starting off as Seafarers during the 500th year of the new era, Nim wasn't much more than a settlement for seafaring folk. This changed as they grew in number, finally creating the floating city albeit on top of Vilbrand shores. The floating city of Nim was the birthplace of the proper scholar, tacticians who moved the tides of war and gave place to the city of Nim as a huge threat during the war, for without the scholars, Nim would have sunk far earlier during the time. Nim worked off tactics of warfare instead of deep understanding of magic. Well, okay, they had an understanding of magic, but it wasn't as powerful as the other 2 nations. Scholar magic is more or less a pact with elementals known as fairies. In order to cast healing magic, they would leave that to the fairies, while on the field, they would advise the troops in proper warfare. Fairies were thought to have been crafted, but this is not entirely true. They are spirits summoned into physical form. I've touched upon this on my video when it came to the Faithful. You might want to go check that one out. And the martial prowess of the Royal Marines was notable in their 3-century-long fight. With their strength, combat ability, and tactical advantage, Nim was set up to at least survive the war. They were humble sailors at first, but after a little time, Nim was a force to be reckoned with, being the only nation to not be taken over upon being threatened by the Magi other than Amdapor. These tactics, however, couldn't last, as luck ran out for a couple of sailors who were lost at sea with a broken ship. A couple of Lalafels found them, patched them and the ship up, and sent them on their way along with a parting gift as a sign of friendship. Little did they know this so-called gift would spell the end for the city of Nim. Upon returning to the floating city, a disease burst forth upon the populace. This disease caused their face to melt, limbs to shrink, and turn their skin green, effectively turning one into a feeble tomberry. I mean, I wouldn't call them feeble, they have something called rancor and they're kind of nightmare inducing, but okay, they're feeble. The cause was a summoned void scent, which was hiding in the gift by the name of Bitoso. Having the ability to hide itself, Bitoso was not found until it was too late. With no other means to stop the disease, the surviving members of NIM sealed away the infected and Bitoso inside the Wanderer's Palace under a barrier of water to never see the light of day again, sending all who was trapped inside into a never-waking slumber. And at that moment, the city of NIM never resurfaced again. In the year 300 of the New Era, Hire came to pass the South Shroud. There, they constructed a city made from an abundance of light-colored rock. This city came to be known as Amdapor. The people then went on to commune with the elementals, asking them if they could partake in the bounty of the forest. The elementals declined their partnership, being distrusting of men. The people of Amdapor respected the wishes of the elementals and did not encroach on their land, and stayed within the confines of their area. The elementals did, however, allow the Ixals to stay within the forest, as they deemed them to be of no threat to the elements. The people of Amdapor would instead focus on fortifying their defenses and expanding outward, rounding up much of the cities that had formed around them, but not in the name of war or force, but in the hands of peace, with Amdapor being the center. Curative and protection magic was discovered when Magi started showing their hands with destruction magic. Wanting to counter this threat, the city of Amdapor started weaving their own magic to be direct counters to the Magi. These spells would be called white magic. Focused purely on restorative and protective magic, the Magi of Amdapor, just like the Magi mages, became drunk on their power and unwittingly started draining ether from the very lands. Proving the elementals right, by the way. Though not on purpose, the white mages caused an imbalance alongside the black mages due to how much ether was needed to use their more powerful spells. And though they were able to match the black mages in battle, their spells more or less only defended their city rather than dispose of their enemies, keeping the stalemate going for centuries till the war came to a disastrous end. In the land of Yafim are uninhabitable saltwater swamps. After the Calamity, this swamp became fertile and people started to colonize there and erect a city. These people, by the 500th year, were the Magi people, and the city of Mach was born. Mach gave birth to one of the most powerful magics alongside with the most powerful mage in recorded history, black magic, and Shatoto. Shatoto was the founder of black magic, which was a much more devastating spellcraft than thaumaturgy. She had shared her teachings in hopes of further strengthening it for a precise day she had predicted to come, and a war was the perfect time to strengthen her craft. Although her means of empowering the craft over the years had led to the continent changing forever, her purpose for doing so was not for that era, but for a future era yet to come, thus the Black Mage quest in the modern time. The city of Mach was founded on a dark principle. They would not hesitate to do the vilest of things to gain the upper hand. For instance, sending a voidsent into a city in order to finish off the populace, or sending a curse to another city via a gift and transforming the entire city of civilians and soldiers into monstrosities. Shatoto also may have not been so different from her fellow countrymen. She was the one who crafted black magic into the destructive power that it is today, and it is possible that she was the most powerful mage that had ever lived. It was also due to her advising that the city of Mach were adept at modern black magic, which took many lives in the war. And other than black magic, they were practitioners of void magic, able to summon creatures of otherworldly powers. These voidsents were summoned by void mages tearing a hole in reality and bringing them forth from a world similar to ours, only covered in darkness. Just a thought, but as I was rewriting this script, we did just get Reapers for Endwalker. Reapers are basically void mages, but we'll see when the expansion comes out. Anyway, the Magi were mostly Lalafell when it came to races, and this probably gave credence to people having a stigma against them. This is probably why people hate potatoes in Final Fantasy XIV for some reason. And why, you may ask why people hate potatoes? potatoes? Well, they thought that because they had the power, they should use it to take over Eorzea, causing a war that would literally span centuries. Not only did they subjugate cities, turn Nim into a Tomberry ranch, and had destroyed much of Amdapor, they also were sucking the ether out of the earth due to their magic use. You could say that these evil potatoes caused the second coming of the Calamity. Well, we all know that isn't true. That was due in part of the Ascians converting yet another world into a pure element and having it combined with the source. However, the ending clash was met with Mach and Amdapor facing off at the gates of Amdapor. When the way was open, the Magi sent in DIABOLOS to finish off the city, but the people of Amdapor bolstered their defenses and trapped DIABOLOS in the center of the city, guarded by the one and only survivor of their guardians, Karibo. With nothing else left, the Magi retreated from the front to reorganize their forces, both having suffered many losses. The seers of the cities had a horrific revelation. Water ether was becoming hugely imbalanced to the point that a flood was imminent. The city-states had to put their differences aside, albeit temporarily, to find a way to avoid this new calamity. The Nimians even set aside their grief due to the plague wrought by the Magi to create a war to stave off the flood called Operation Maelstrom, crafting floating wards that still stand to this day. And from here to the end of this era, everyone would be doing their best to survive this new calamity. Amdapor rallied their people to Abelathia's spine. Abandoning the city they spent many lives protecting, they took shelter in Giribania's highlands. The Magi, who believed the Ark would come and save them, drowned, while those who sought immediate safety ventured to Yephame's high grounds, only to find infertile grounds and salty swamps. And Nim ventured to the mountains in Outer Lenoska, where the war did curb the flood a fair bit, but not entirely, since villages and coastal towns were swallowed by the sea. Mach, being the ever so advanced thinkers that they were, sought to create an ark that would safely keep everyone in the sky and away from the flood. That whole event ended in failure, as the ship was attacked on the inside by the very void sent meant to be the power source of the ship. Now, as for the elementals bearing witness to all this, they showed slight mercy to Amdapor, covering it in a thick greenery so as to protect the vestige, and for good reason. Remember, DIABOLOS was still in there. There is a legend saying that 12 archons forewarned the people of the impending calamity. Whether they were to be 12 gods or 12 regular people is due to be said, but know this, without their warning of when the flood was to come, there may have been even more damage to the people of Eorzea. And now, a hidden result at the end of the calamity came to be in an unlikely union. A few survivors of both Mach and Amdapor ended up wanting to find a way to protect the populace of both Magi and Amdaporian. This resulted in a new class of magic called red magic. Neither side of the art was stronger than the other, but it had the best of both worlds. Red mages were at the time of the calamity protectors of their newfound home, an art made to protect instead of waging war. And because the ether used for the art used two different types of magic, they opted the destruction of the art for the speed of which it could be cast. And unbeknownst to them, red magic also helped with the balancing issue in the ether. So for better or worse, red magic was created from this long war, and even though two factions came together in the end, it wasn't long after the flood had subsided that both sides would go their separate ways, one retreating back to the Shroud and the other roaming farther south towards Thanalan. And it is here where we will stop, for the Age of Prosperity is next, and trust me when I say this, it is quite bloated, so until then, stay vigilant. Oh, and don't worry, it's not going to take me another year to make Eorzea Historia 5. I am currently writing 5 as we speak, so thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. And as I said before, stay vigilant, my fellow heroes.